Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you today to our discussion of higher education in 2021 and beyond, the National Outlook. I'm George Blumenthal. I'm the director of the UC Berkeley Center for Studies in Higher Education, and in a former life was the chancellor of University of California at Santa Cruz. And I'm so delighted today to be able to welcome Ted Mitchell and Craig Linworm to join us for that discussion. It is an extremely timely moment to be discussing issues of higher education because the past year has seen two major effects that can affect higher education into the future. One is, of course, the pandemic, and the other is the recent election of Joe Biden as president. And there are a host of issues facing higher education, and we'll try to discuss as many of them as we can today. But those issues will include student loans, the stimulus bill and direct support for colleges and universities, some changes that we might expect at the Department of Education, the effect of a new administration on Daca, as well as its effect on visas for foreign students. We'll discuss research funding or the future of research funding, as well as funding for Pell grants, and much, much more today. So let me begin by introducing our two guests. Ted Mitchell is the president of the American Council of Education, a position he's held since 2017. Previously, he was the United States Undersecretary of Education during the second Obama administration. He's been the chief executive officer of the New Schools Venture Fund, which supports higher education. He's been a member of the California State Board of Education, and from 1999 to 2005, he was the president of Occidental College. He's been a dean at UCLA and a professor at Dartmouth College, and he's been a member of the Stanford University Board of Trustees, which, by the way, was his alma mater. Craig Linworm is the vice president for governmental affairs at the Association of Public Land-Grant Universities since 2012. He promotes and advocates for higher education before both Congress and the executive branch. He's written numerous commentaries on higher education in many media outlets. And prior to joining the APLU, Craig was a senior legislative assistant and deputy communications director on Capitol Hill. So before we actually begin our discussion, let me just mention two things really quickly. First, this discussion is being recorded, and a recording of the presentation will be made available for viewing as soon as the program is finished. So you can watch it later on or send your friends to the presentation. Secondly, if you're watching this on YouTube, as most of you are, and if you'd like to ask a question, please submit your question via the chat function on YouTube. I'll try to get to as many questions as possible, time permitting. So with that concluded, let's begin the discussion. And I'd like to put out a question for both of you that I think a lot of people are wondering about. We know there's a lot of discussion right now of a new stimulus bill, and that might even be passed before the Biden administration takes office. Given the stresses that most colleges and universities are under these days, how much direct support do you think is appropriate for higher education at this point? And what are the chances that such a bill might pass either before or after the transition? Ted, would you like to start?
Sure. Thanks, George, and quite a robust agenda you've laid out for us, and I look forward to the conversation. And thanks everyone for joining this morning. You know, it's interesting. Craig and I were on a call earlier today, talking about just this issue and among other things. You know, we have made it clear to our friends in Congress, both houses, both sides of the aisle, that the impact of the coronavirus on higher education has been profound. The direct costs of PPE, testing, new regulations and requirements for how students, faculty, and staff move around the campus, and foregone earnings, foregone income from the obvious things of tuition and room and board to the less obvious things like parking and other auxiliary enterprises. We're still in the process of collecting information about that from all of our members, and as you know, ACE represents 2-year, 4-year public and private But we've asked for $120 billion in the next stimulus bill. We believe that's a conservative estimate of the costs that institutions have borne and will continue to bear throughout this academic year. To be clear and honest, whether we get to 120 or not, it remains to be seen. But that's our marker, and we're going to stick to it. Craig?
Well, thanks, Ted, and certainly a plus one on the gratitude for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And we wouldn't be the higher education community if we didn't have other asks on top of that. So, there is a real united effort behind this $120 billion request, which the community is advocating behind, which is priority number one. We are also really focused on top priorities around research relief for institutions. So a request around $26 billion, recognizing the substantial costs that research universities have experienced to ramp down research and then ramp research back up as institutions have reopened, and in some cases experienced some difficulties with reopening, have incurred substantial costs relative to the research enterprise. And so the research universities have requested $26 billion to help with research relief. On top of that, of course, a request for help with limited and temporary liability protections, as well as some issues around tax relief. I would note that there are some provisions in some of the bills that have been introduced that unfortunately have not provided the same tax relief for public universities that have been extended to private entities. So we want to ensure that there's some equity in for public institutions in most notably the paid leave tax credit. So ensuring that state entities are eligible for that important benefit.
Great, thank you. And just to put it into perspective, how much money was allocated in the previous recovery bill that passed earlier this year for universities? We're asking for 120 billion now. What was the previous number?
So the CARES Act provided $14 billion in the comparable account. So you might say we're asking for a little bit more this time.
Okay.
We feel that extra zero is quite important.
Okay. No, I just wanted to put it into context for people who
Absolutely
are listening to this discussion. Well, there's another immediate issue that's coming up, and that's the fact that right now for student loans, there is a deferral of payment that extends into December, so that people holding student loans are not required to pay off those student loans at least until December. But December is nearly upon us, and many feel that restarting payments at this time will cause significant pain within a number of populations in the country who hold student debt. Do you think the moratorium on repayment of student debt will be extended? And when do you think that might happen?
So I'll take a first shot at it. And again, Craig and I were lucky enough to be on a call with our government relations colleagues from around the sector this morning, and this is certainly high on everyone's agenda and central to our concern about students going forward. And I'll let Craig talk about where that conversation went. But in anticipation of it, I think that ACE and TCAS and NAFSA, the Student Financial Aid Association, sent out a letter last week asking / demanding that the extension be made. And so we're now working at the next level, which is more the retail level, with associations and institutions to try to get that word out, both to the Education Department and to our members in Congress. Craig?
Yeah, I would just add that we would hope that there's broad recognition that the economic conditions that necessitated that moratorium haven't so significantly changed, and so that certainly warrants an extension.
Great, thank you. But more generally, once a new president is inaugurated, do you see it likely that Congress or the Department of Education will approve changes in the student loan program, either to reduce debt or to somehow continue to defer payment? For example, there's been discussion of reducing debt for graduates who go into public service work, or there's also been proposals to reduce debt for everyone. Would you like to comment on that?
Sure, I'm happy to take a stab at that one, and I think this gets into a topic that I know we'll discuss a little later as well, which is this goes to the core of whether Congress can tackle big higher education issues. Can Congress get into a Higher Education Act reauthorization, or sorry to maybe get a little weedy, but address higher education issues through a process called budget reconciliation, where some of these big things can be done. There is an active and spirited discussion underway within the Democratic Party about executive authority to do debt forgiveness or cancellation, and it looks like that is going to be continue to be a debate within the Democratic Party, and perhaps a divisive one between perhaps kind of the farther left of the party and a more moderate or right center right side of the party. If you look at the political dynamics on Capitol Hill, so if you look at this as a legislative issue, it's a pretty difficult issue to legislate on. Looking into the dynamics for next year, the House will of course remain in Democratic control. Their majority will have narrowed some. But you would assume that they should be able to pass Democratic priorities through the House. In the Senate, there are two races that are still underway in Georgia that will determine control of the Senate. Most would say that Republicans are favored to maintain control of the Senate. If that's the case, then it would be pretty difficult to do the kinds of large-scale debt forgiveness that a lot of progressive Democrats are calling for.
Ted, would you like to add anything?
Just a couple quick things. I think that when we think about, Craig's exactly right, that there's much more to be discussed and much more to be understood about Congress's appetite and ability to take on broad higher ed reform, and I think that that's going to be something that he and I are going to be watching very, very closely going forward. On the loan relief thing in particular, George, I think I'd like to just break it into three parts, and sort of from the narrowest to the broadest. So I think that in its narrowest sense, there is a sense that there is a subset of student loan borrowers who have been deceived by rapacious institutions, and there was a regulation in the Obama administration to provide relief against that. Borrower defense against repayment is a technical name. And so I think that there will be energy to repeal the Trump era re-regulation about borrower defense to make it clearer and easier for defrauded students to have their loans refunded. Second, there is, as Craig noted, a robust conversation about broader student loan debt and relief. And I think that will play itself out, whether it's through executive authority or legislative relief. There are different proposals about how much, under what circumstances, under whose authority should broader loan relief be provided. And I think that that's aiming at getting at the increasing evidence that there is a substantial default rate problem among student borrowers, particularly Black Americans who have borrowed loans. And then finally, I think that there's the question about how should we think about student borrowing on a going forward basis. You raised public service loan forgiveness as an example. That's an area in which the government several administrations ago decided that public service was a virtuous enterprise for our graduates, and that should be recognized through some sort of modification of their student loans. I believe that that kind of provision is still important. I think that it will get a lot of attention, it will get a lot of support, but speaking as one who was involved in administering that program, it's a mess, and it needs cleaning up. So I hope that happens. But even more broadly, I think that we need to accept the fact that our student loan program has grown and changed by accretion. We've added things to it. It looks like an unkempt garden at the moment. And I think that really identifying several basic loan programs for our students, some based on a traditional mortgage repayment like we do with our homes, others based on income-based repayment. I think having a very simplified set of loans will be very helpful going forward.
Great, thank you. Let me quick follow up. Isn't it still the case that the federal loan program is a significant source of income for the federal government?
So it is. It is not as significant a source of income as is often portrayed in the press and in the media. It depends in part on how you look at it. So long term, the federal loan program it breaks even. In the short term, as people do repay their loans, that some of that revenue is available to the federal government. That's right.
Okay. Thank you.
And I'd be remiss to if I did not note that given the interest rates that graduate students pay on their loans, that the federal government is doing better by graduate students.
Interesting. Thank you. That's a good point, which I think a lot of graduate students would like to know. So since we're talking about money and students, I want to note that Joe Biden has proposed that public college education should be free for all students whose families earn less than $125,000. There's been a lot of discussion of free college education during the campaign. Do you see this as happening in the next few years?
So I think Craig and I drew straws last night, and I get to go first. I get to go first on this one. So I think that it's a great question. It will be a question that we'll spend a lot of time on in Congress and in public debates. So I think it is an operational question. I don't think if there is divided government, I don't think that there is a fast track to free college. I think that it's important to remember when we talk about these proposals that they are mostly lined up around free tuition. And so as many activists and others point out, tuition is in many cases not an insignificant, but only one portion of what it costs students to attend. I think in particular that's the case for community college students whose age and station in life tends to be they tend to be older. They they have family obligations, work responsibilities. And so tuition is in fact against childcare, foregone earnings, those kinds of things, one of many expenses. And so I think when we think about free college, I prefer, and I think we prefer in the association world to step back and talk about college affordability. and to think about college affordability as a package that includes things like childcare, that includes tuition, that includes room and board, that includes books and fees. And so I think that we appreciate the opportunity for a debate about more public funding for any part of that. But and then I'll turn it over to Craig. I think where Craig and I would like to start is with actually a much simpler proposal, which is to double the Pell Grant.
So I would start also by going to answer George on the political dynamic of your question. I think you need to see who's going to maintain control of the Senate. It's difficult to see the path forward on that proposal with a Republican majority in the Senate. So, seeing how those two Georgia Senate races play out, I think will be quite consequential to the ability of Democrats to pass a proposal that ambitious. I would also note that because the Biden free college proposal is a federal-state partnership, it also hinges on the participation of states. So, even passage at the federal level is really step one. And so, getting states to participate, to opt into the program would be another crucial step.
Great. Yes, thank you. It would be interesting noting the Georgia Senate races, as you pointed out, Greg. It would be interesting if higher education became a major issue for the Senate races in Georgia, but that is yet to be seen.
Hey, George, can I throw in one more thing?
Absolutely.
I just want to, as Craig would say, a +1 on his comment about states. You have two guys on the panel who spend a lot of our time focusing on Congress and things going on in Washington. But as everyone viewing knows, traditionally higher education, particularly public higher education, has been a state, federal, and family partnership. And lest we forget, states are under incredible financial pressure during this pandemic and the economic downturn as well. But I know that I'm speaking on behalf of the public universities as well as the privates who are supported by state financial aid, scholarships, and so on. States need to stay in this game. States need to continue to provide assistance to institutions and to individual students to be able to make this system work. The federal government cannot and should not become the sole funder of higher education in America.
Well, that's a really good point, Ted. And I guess I would remind you or let you comment on the fact that during the Obama administration, the Recovery Act actually specified that the states needed to continue their support for higher education in order for additional funding to come. So it was indeed seen as a partnership, and apparently it worked, unless you want to dispute that.
No dispute, and I think that that's exactly where Craig was pointing us in looking at the Biden proposal and thinking about identifying it as a state and federal partnership. And I think that's it's the right formula for higher education going forward.
Yeah,
Please go ahead, Craig.
Oh, I'm sorry, George. I do think as we dig deeper into these important proposals, and I mean, first, I think we begin with a recognition of wanting to, applaud a focus on affordability, particularly for those who need the most support. And for APLU, obviously, no hesitation in applauding affordability within the public sector, where more than 3/4 of all students are within the public sector. As we look at a federal state partnership, some dynamics could emerge as we get into the weeds of these kinds of policies. So, for example, if a partnership is uniquely focused on driving new state funding only for the purpose of tuition reduction, what does that do for the many other purposes of state support for public higher education, including student support services, and support for faculty, and support for academic quality, and the vast array of uses for state investment in public higher education. So these issues can get weedy very quickly, but I think we begin with the fundamental recognition that in APLU's eyes, the biggest problem that we have in higher education is states backing away from the historical support of public higher ed, and it is monumental and applaudable to have a focus on policy to try to get states back to the table.
George, I'm afraid that you asked a question that's just that Craig and I think a lot about, and I know that folks on the video do as well. And I would say absolutely to what Craig has said. We've alluded to doubling Pell a couple of times, and providing support for students beyond tuition. I think it's unsaid, I'll say it now though, is the important role that independent institutions play, and the community colleges play in this ecosystem of higher education. And so as we think about the affordability issue, I think it's critical that we think about all of the players in the system and make sure that we are providing opportunities for students to access and succeed in the kinds of institutions where they will thrive. And that runs the gamut from small rural community colleges to liberal arts colleges, religiously based institutions, comprehensive state institutions, and flagships. And we need to keep all of them in mind as we think about affordability.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And in fact, as we know, in the United States, something like 70% of bachelor's degrees are awarded by public universities. But that also means that 30% are awarded by non-public universities, and that's an important component of our ecosystem of higher education. So Craig kind of alluded to this already and began the discussion, but let me just ask it in any event. And that is the trade-off between free tuition and support for colleges and universities. Because there's been a lot of discussion in academia in the last few years about the fact that if your goal is really to increase college completion in the US, if that is your primary goal, then people have asked, is it better to buy out tuition and make it easier or more affordable for students to attend college? Or is it better to invest in support services and teaching within colleges themselves as a way of getting students through both faster and more efficiently? And much of the research suggests that investing in the colleges is the preferable solution. I wonder if either of you would like to comment on that, particularly with regard to federal policy.
I guess a brief comment here is I've never spoken to a school that wouldn't like flexibility with resources. To be able to look at their unique circumstances and adapt federal funding to the circumstances that they have on the ground and their read of how those resources can best be put to use given their circumstances. So it's kind of a broad comment about the need for flexibility.
Yeah, George, Craig's right, 100%. And I think that what we need to be, federal policy is at best a blunt instrument. And I think we have to be careful when we take a blunt instrument and try to make it into a precision tool. And I think that is as much a reminder to advocates as it is to institutions. But on the other side, I think that the point that you raise is critical for institutions. Let's presume that Craig wins the day and that federal resources are delivered in a flexible way, and that institutions then have the responsibility to use them to make sure that more students have access to their offerings and that they succeed in making it through to their destination, which is a degree. Let's remember that one of the before the pandemic, back in the old times, one of the things that we were correctly worried about was the 50% completion rate of our students in higher education. That's if it's changing, it may be changing in the wrong direction. But my point isn't so much that macro point. It's that let's help institutions talk about and be transparent about their outcomes in a way that will reassure policymakers and funders that indeed the flexibility that's being given to institutions is being matched by a responsibility to use those resources in a way that helps students succeed.
Yes, thank you. Good point. So both of you have alluded to a desire to double the amount of the size of Pell grants. Some people have even called for tripling Pell Grant awards to help defray the cost of living, basically. But there's also questions about whether or not eligibility for Pell Grants might be changed over time. Do you see that as likely in the next few years? As I know part of the answer may depend upon the Senate, but do you think that there's much of an appetite for that within the federal government?
I'll start. I think that sure is the short answer. I think that there's always an appetite to have the conversation about thresholds. I think that those are very difficult conversations to have. I think that in the short run, we in the higher ed advocacy community believe that we can have that conversation best after we have bolstered the amount of money flowing through the current plumbing. So let's not replumb the house before we get the water to the students who need it.
Totally makes sense. Thank you. Well, we've already talked about two of the major elements of federal funding for higher education, namely student loans and Pell Grants. But probably the third major area of federal funding for higher education is for research. And a lot of that money flows through the National Science Foundation or NASA or the Department of Energy or other agencies such as the NIH or the National Endowment for the Humanities or for the Arts. How do you see the prospects for that changing in a new Biden administration?
Well, we're very optimistic about the incoming administration and support for the research mission of universities. We know this is an area where the president-elect has a long track record, and it's not just an issue that is professional to him. It's also an issue that's personal to him. When you listen to how he speaks about the importance of research, including medical research, he has championed this cause when he was in the Senate, certainly as vice president and throughout the campaign. He clearly identifies with the ability of research to have real impacts in people's lives. I think most notably on the medical research side, but also broader, and has spoken about research as driving our economy and the innovations that we are to create in the future. He has also, said not too long ago, we have, I'm probably not getting the quote perfect, but more great research universities in the U.S. than the rest of the world combined. So he sees it. If you look at his transition team, the agency review teams, and how many scholars and researchers who are included on agency review teams, he clearly respects the role of science. And so I think it gives us significant reason for optimism about the incoming administration and their support for our institution's research mission.
Great. Ted, is there anything you'd like to add?
No, I think Craig's got it.
Okay, great. Well, that's an optimistic assessment, and many of us hope that it's correct. That's great. Well, one other thing that is likely to happen with the new Biden administration is that he will appoint a new Secretary of Education, and that will have some significant implications down the line. Perhaps one of the most controversial issues that has faced higher education because of the previous secretary has been the changes in Title IX rules with regard to enforcement of sexual harassment or sexual violence rules at universities. That changed under President Obama, and then it's changed again dramatically under President Trump or Secretary DeVos. Do you see this as likely to be a high priority of the next administration?
I do, and I think Craig was talking about President-elect Biden's personal commitment to research, and I think here too, when he was Vice President Biden was a major leader and a major voice in the administration on behalf of all sets of women's issues and issues of sexual violence. And so this is a matter of personal concern and interest and commitment to President-elect Biden. The team has been clear that they do not admire the current regulations, and that they will do what they can early on in the administration to suspend them and to replace them. And I think that we have already begun engaging with them. Again, Craig and I and other advocates spend a great deal of time not only encouraging them to withdraw the regulations, but beginning to think about what a process and an outcome might look like that would be fair to all parties, including institutions, as institutions try to make sure that that our campuses are safe and secure.
If I could just quickly follow up, since I understand that the Trump administration went through all of the regulatory process in changing those regulations, does that mean then that the incoming Biden administration will have to go through as well a long process of public comments, et cetera, lasting many months before those regulations can be changed again?
Yes. Yeah, and to just review the history, during the Obama administration, the administration relied on what's called guidance, which is short of a regulation and shorter still from statute. It's an interpretation of statute, but it doesn't carry the force of law. And so the Trump regulations are indeed the first regulations that tackle Title IX, and so they are in law and will need to be withdrawn by basically retracing our steps.
Great, thank you. So I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about Daca. And just to review briefly, Daca was instituted by the Obama administration as an executive order. And the Trump administration has attempted many times to cut back or eliminate the Daca program, which has been successfully resisted through court action, going all the way to the Supreme Court. But DACA is not the healthiest federal program right now. Do you see the Biden administration turning on its heels from day one to try to reinstitute the full DACA or perhaps go even further than the Obama administration did?
Well, I think we would have to expect, and certainly we are encouraging that this be a first priority, which is to restore the DACA program to the maximum extent possible. Accepting new applications in addition to renewals, and trying to build momentum again for legislating on this issue, because ultimately DACA is a patch on what is a broken system that really needs to be handled legislatively, so that we have a permanent fix that provides dreamers the relief that they need, which is really and deserve, which is a path to citizenship and work authorization.
Great.
Greg's totally right, and this is it's a long-term problem, and we've known that it was a long-term problem through two administrations. The good news here, unlike Title IX, is that we are dealing in the area of executive orders and executive action, and so I think that we can expect the team Biden has been clear that this is if not a day one priority, at least a first week priority to put the patch back in place, to use Craig's language, and make sure that dreamers have access to the full DACA program. I think that we can take some great comfort in this week's legal decisions that rolled back these are often double and triple negatives, that rolled back the prohibition issued by the Trump administration against renewals and new applications. So that's good news in the short run. In the short run, I look forward to the Biden administration renewing an executive order, and in the longer run, I look forward to a resolution of the long-term status of dreamers and path to citizenship that Craig referenced.
And just add, in this setting, how could we not thank the University of California for their work in this area, including in litigation?
Exactly right.
Well, on behalf of the University of California, thank you. So another area that has been of some controversy and change during the Trump administration has been the oversight and regulation of private for-profit colleges. As you may recall, during the Obama administration, there were increasing amounts of oversight and accountability for the for-profit sector in higher education. Many of those were rolled back during the Trump administration under Secretary DeVos. Do you see a significant change coming here?
I think that the DeVos administration did indeed, as you say, roll back protections, and I mentioned the borrower defense regulations earlier. I think that we need to start with a basic two basic understandings that are somewhat contradictory. One is that tax status doesn't necessarily indicate quality. So I think that we need to accept the very real, not just possibility, but the reality that there are for-profit institutions that are doing a good job for their students. On the other hand, we need to recognize the fact that while for-profit institutions account for about 11% of student enrollments in higher education, those enrollments account for over 45% of student loan defaults. And so there is a mismatch between what many for-profit institutions are offering their students and what students end up achieving. So I think that the key to this, and we've talked about it a couple times, the key to this is being very clear about being able to measure student outcomes and to be able to hold institutions accountable for that. One of the other regulations that the DeVos administration ended was the so-called Gainful Employment regulation. That was aimed at doing just that, to measuring student employment outcomes against the debt that they incurred through their programs. Interesting to note that while many think of regulation as a stick to punish institutions, it's also simply a yardstick. And so we found in the Obama administration that once those regulations were promulgated, many for-profit institutions ended programs that were not meeting the needs of their students. And so having something like that in place in a way that doesn't provide, that doesn't incur a tremendous amount of institutional administrative cost, I think is something that we need to take a hard look at.
Thank you. Craig, do you have anything to add?
I would just add that, I would plus one on most of Ted's comments there. And note that it's appropriate for federal policy to recognize the disproportionate risks that exists in the for-profit sector, while also recognizing that it's not necessarily bad outcomes are not necessarily exclusively within the for-profit sector. And so it's important to protect students and taxpayers. Overall, a gainful employment rule is one critical aspect of that. Bar defense to repayment is another. Fixing the broken cohort default rate test, which is something that unfortunately has become practically meaningless, is another piece of an important accountability plan, is something that we think Congress really needs to look at within a Higher Education Act reauthorization.
So I'd like to ask you about the Higher Education Reauthorization Act, or Higher Education Act. I can remember maybe 5 or 6 years ago being in Washington, D.C., and I can't remember whether I was at an ACE meeting or an APLU meeting, but I do recall Senator Lamar Alexander from the Senate saying, who's Republican in the Senate, saying how he was working with Senator Patty Murray to put together a bipartisan Higher Education Act that he seriously hoped would pass. Well, that did not come to pass, and the Higher Education Act is still pending in Washington. Do you see it likely that such an act will pass?
Next year, 2 years from now, 10 years, 20 years?
You choose the time scale.
Well, I would go back to my remarks about what happens with the two the two Georgia races. I guess let's first talk a little bit about the retirement of Chairman Alexander, which is a tremendous loss to the institution. To talk about qualifications for the job. I mean, we don't know yet who. Let's say for a moment, if the Senate does not flip, we don't know yet who a Republican chairman or chairwoman would be. But those are some tough shoes to fill. A former governor, university president, secretary of education. I don't know that there will ever be another chairman who has that background. So, and also such a long record of striking bipartisan deals with the ranking Democrat. So, that is a significant piece that will make even just that relationship between the chairman and the ranking member, and perhaps having to start anew is actually one dynamic that could make an HEA reauthorization more difficult.
Great, thank you. Let me ask about foreign students in the United States. One of the things that we're seeing this year nationwide is a decline in the percentage of foreign students who've come to study in the US. And the decline is particularly alarming among entering students. In other words, first-year students coming to the US. Some of that may have to do with visa issues. Do you see that situation turning around in the next administration?
Well, oh, sorry, Ted, do you want to take that one, or would you like me to? We certainly hope. We certainly hope so. I think we have to recognize that there are long-term trends and there are short-term trends. There are some long-term trends here that are a problem and can't necessarily be pinned, just on recent policy or an administration. Our competitor countries have gotten more competitive with us. At the same time, there have been quite a number of self-inflicted wounds. We have sent the wrong messages abroad about our nation as welcoming to international students. We have proposed policies that would make ourselves less competitive, would actually make it more difficult for international students to come here, and would actually make it more difficult for international students to stay here and have the ability to work and live in the United States after graduating, which is something that many international students are deeply interested in. Many of them want to study here, but they also want to know that there are possibly opportunities following graduation that to possibly secure employment and start lives in the United States and contribute here. And unfortunately, we don't have the policy nationally to support that. And in many cases, we've actually gone backwards. So we hope that the incoming administration can begin with reversing the harmful messages that have been sent abroad, and then we could start making progress in making improvements with policy.
Yeah, I think Craig's right on all counts, and I think that in terms of addressing the short-term problems, we have an issue on the ground in terms of processing visas. The State Department needs to send a very clear message of their expectation about how to process visas. We have a next order set of issues having to do with regulation and proposed regulation around everything from time and status, which is being narrowed, unfortunately, and then all the way up to H-1B visas. Craig mentioned the connection between research and international scholars, and I just want to double down on that. I think that we tend to think about the 43%, George, that you referenced, 43% decline in first-year student enrollment from abroad is a staggering number. There is no decline like it in higher education, and it should worry all of us. That top line number, I think, masks what may be an even more dire long-term problem, which is the reduction in the number of graduate students from the finest undergraduate programs in the world coming to the United States to do graduate and doctoral work. And as Craig points out, in many, many cases, if not most cases, with the intention of staying in the United States, participating in our entrepreneurial economy and helping to drive forward discovery and the creation around those discoveries of progress on all fields. So I worry about the top line number. I worry perhaps even more about the hollowing out of the research enterprise that is so core to our university's health and to our country's prosperity.
Thank you. Good point. Thank you. My next question is perhaps a little bit unfair, but I will ask it anyway. And that is to note that with the likelihood of a new vaccine, to address COVID, it is really likely that most, if not all, colleges and universities will be fully reopened for in-person learning by the fall of 2021. And I would just say personally, I was very impressed by how rapidly colleges and universities were able to convert to online education almost at the drop of a hat last winter and spring. And it raises the question about what will be the primary modes of instruction across the country once the pandemic is ended. And that, well, for the most part, is an issue within the authority of the colleges and universities themselves. But do you see that issue playing out at all in Washington, D.C. in terms of funding bills or congressional intent with regard to universities?
I think I want to go back to my blunt instrument observation earlier. I guess my short and somewhat snarky answer is I hope not. I do think that we have learned, and agree entirely, George, that anyone who thought that higher education was a slow-moving beast that could never change sort of didn't observe the spring. Right. Everybody changed the way they think about this, and the results, although not perfect, I think have been marvelous in terms of sustaining student access and progress across the board. So I think that we've learned a lot. My guess is that institution by institution, decisions will be made about combining in-person instruction with online instruction. I think hybrid will become even more than now an overused word. But I think it's important because at the same time that we've learned to use new tools, we've also learned to appreciate the circumstances of this new normal student, who is not the 18-year-old who gets dropped off for a residential experience. Although that certainly will happen, and that's great. But there is a wide swath of Americans who need education and re-education. And the tools that we, I think, have become more comfortable with will be important in helping our institutions meet those. But as far as federal regulation or incentives, I think that this is something that I hope to Craig's great point earlier, that the government provides flexible resources so that we can continue this grand outreach that we've begun.
Thank you. Well, we're nearly out of time, but I'd like to ask one last question of the two of you. With the election of Joe Biden, we now have a First Lady, Jill Biden, who will have two interesting firsts. She intends to be the first White House spouse to actually pursue a career outside the White House, and she is also a community college instructor. Do you see that as, do you see her role as being key to changing the impression of higher education throughout the federal government?
Yes. and I leapt in, Craig, only because I want to lead with an anecdote. So Dr. Biden is the real deal. She is not only a great community college faculty member, but she cares about, thinks about, worries about making opportunities for low-income first-generation students of color, and it is a profound set of priorities for her, and we'll see that expressed publicly, and we will learn that those are expressed privately. I had the opportunity to do a brief tour of a couple of community college campuses with Dr. Biden, and we flew from city to city on Air Force Two. And I don't imagine any other second lady, or now soon to be first lady, writing comments on student papers across the country as we flew on Air Force Two. But that's what Jill Biden did, and that's what she cares about. And so we talked more about her students and her students' work and their aspirations than we ever had before. And she is an impressive woman, an impressive leader, and we'll hear more from her.
Thank you so much, Ted. That's a great answer, and it's a great way to end our conversation because, unfortunately, time has flown and our time is up. But I want to thank both of you, both Craig and Ted, for spending this hour with us. I think we've covered a lot of higher education issues, and I want to thank you for your frank answers and your eloquent answers as we went through a range of issues. So thank you again.
Thank you, George, and thanks everyone for joining us.
Thank